Today we're doing session number 35, and this will begin at 1 Kings 18. We're back into the Kings. This is not a long section because I go quickly through the Kings, but there are some high points. In order to understand the high points, I'm going to have to I'll share a screen in a minute with a whole bunch of dates on it. It's what I call a timeline for the northern and the southern kingdoms during this period. And I'll show some of the high points that are the keys for understanding what's going on here. I'm wishing that I had direct access to a whiteboard because that would be easier, but this will do. We'll make this work. The events that begin in chapter 18 continue the story of Elijah. Elijah's date is around 875 or so BC. And the Elijah, Elisha stories continue for probably 25 or 30 years. We don't have real good tags on this, but this goes on for a while. Elijah and then his disciple Elisha were raised up in the northern kingdom to counteract the worship of Baal that was becoming the scourge of the north. Elijah is represents the second great wave of biblical prophecy. The first wave of prophecy is Moses and Joshua. And that wave is marked by the rise of miracles. So Moses was able to turn a stick into a snake and make the waters into blood and then cross the Red Sea. The ultimate miracle, the penultimate miracle here in the Moses episode is the crossing of the Red Sea. It's emblematic of so many things, of Israel's baptism into Moses and the beginning of a new life and all of that. Moses was given the ability to call down miracles in order to authenticate his message, which is a message from God. So miracles authenticate God's messenger with God's message. And always in biblical terms, this is always the newly inspired revelation from God. So Moses and then Joshua. Joshua also had a series of miracles: the crossing of the Jordan River, the 24 hours turned into a longer period of time, the destruction of Jericho. Joshua also had some miracles. And so there's this transitional period from the Egyptian sojourn to the beginning of life in the Promised Land, where there is a period of miracles and the beginning of biblical revelation. In the Kings, we're seeing another transitional episode as David and then Solomon unite the kingdom. Things reach a crescendo. We see Solomon take the kingdom to its highest point, its greatest prosperity and its greatest extent of control, and thus the extent of God's blessing in many ways. After Solomon, we see a division of the kingdom into a north and a south, what we call Israel and Judah. And with that, we see a split in the timelines. So we'll have a series of dates for the north and a series of dates for the south. And there's a different set of kings in the north and in the south. At the same time, around 875 BC, Elijah is called. And while Elijah does not write scripture, he is the first of the Old Testament prophetic line, and his ministry is marked by prophecy. The same is going to, or marked by miracles. The same thing is going to be true of Elisha, who is Elijah's disciple. Both of them do miracles, up to and including not resurrections exactly, but resuscitations of people who were dead. The miraculous ministry serves to authenticate this new string of prophets and their prophetic ministry. And we'll notice that later on, other prophets who pop up ahead of the exile are not going to be they're not going to be accompanied by miracles. So Isaiah, the greatest of the Old Testament prophets after Moses, is not doing miracles. His ministry is authenticated by the miracles of Elijah and Elisha. So that's where we are, and that's what we're going to see. I'm going to share the screen. Let's see here, share screen. Okay, see if that comes up. Yeah, there it comes. This is the timeline for the divided kingdom. I had some fun with my iPad making this thing up because I don't have a very good whiteboard to do it all on. And this was easier. There's too much detail here. You notice the timeline starts. Well, let's see here. I'm going to get my pointer to turn into a laser pointer. So here we see the dividing point right over here, and it divides between north and south with the rebellion of Jeroboam in the north against Rehoboam in the south. Now, I haven't added their names because we've already covered them. The major kings in the north, there's some minor kings after Jeroboam, but then we have Omri. Omri is the great king of the northern kingdom. He's going to be the king for 11 years, and he moves the kingdom capital to Samaria. Very big deal. His son, Ahab, will go all the way down to 853. And so we sometimes call these the Omride dynasty, Omri and Ahab. It's only two kings, but they lasted a long time and frankly did a lot of damage. Both Omri and Ahab were exceedingly evil men. It's significant that Elijah and then Elisha are raised up at this time to oppose Ahab. It's interesting. The prophets almost always have a political flavor to them. They exist in the official court or on the fringes of the official court, and they are people who have the ear of the kings. So there is always this political flavor. Now, at the same time as Omri and Ahab, we see a good king in the south, Jehoshaphat. Jumping Jehoshaphat runs from 872 to 848. Reigned a long time, is a very stable time in Judah. Following Ahab, we see some minor kings, and then an important king, Jehu, from 840 to 814, who reigned a long time. He was an evil man. All of the northern kings are evil. There aren't any good ones at all. After Jehu, a series of evil kings, and then a king who reigned a long time, Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II reigns in the north at about the same time that Uzziah reigned in the south. And this was a time of tremendous stability and prosperity for the north. This was the golden age of the north. Following 760 BC, there is a rapid decline of the northern kingdom, with invasions by Assyria that began in 732, followed by the destruction of Samaria and the fall of the northern kingdom in 722 BC. In the south, the good kings are Jehoshaphat, then Joash, followed by Uzziah, and then finally Hezekiah. And I haven't given you all of their dates, but 740 BC is going to be important for us because that is the year in which King Uzziah died. Isaiah, in the reference to his call, tells us in Isaiah 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. So there is 740 BC. That's the beginning of Isaiah's ministry. There are some other minor prophets who come before Isaiah who fill up this era. So Elijah is the beginning of the prophetic ministry. He's followed by writing prophets, the greatest of whom is Isaiah, prior to the Babylonian exile. Now, next time I show you a timeline, we'll begin with Isaiah in the southern kingdom and run on through Judah down to the close of the period of freedom for the southern kingdom in 586 BC. Okay, that's the timeline. For my students in Spokane, all of these dates that you see are important. Many of them will be on the test, and I'll highlight those for you in class. All right, click. Here's one of my favorite statues. It's a terrible picture. I took this with film and then scanned it. I have not been back to this place since I started using digital cameras. So this is the best picture I've got. That's Elijah on Mount Carmel with his sword drawn and apparently whooping on prophets of Baal. From verses 19 through 40 of chapter 18, we see this episode of the confrontation with the prophets of Baal. Elijah was raised up to demonstrate that Baal worship was simply wrong. The first thing that we hear Elijah saying is that there would be no rain. Now, rain is important because the prophets of Baal claimed that they could make it rain by worshiping Baal, by simply doing the things that they did, their sacrifices and their rituals. They could force the heavens to open and Baal to bring rain. They actually claimed that they could cause the resurrection of Baal. The Baal cycle is a cycle of death and resurrection. As Baal dies in the dry season and is brought back to life again in the rainy season every year. The prophets of Baal and of Asherah claimed that their ministrations, which were heavily sensual, prostitution and partying primarily, that these things would cause Baal to be resurrected and thus to come back into the land of the living and do that thing he does with rain. Elijah was here to demonstrate on many, many levels that the claims of the Baal prophets were simply wrong. On Mount Carmel, which is a very prominent peninsula jutting out into the Mediterranean Sea near Haifa in Israel, the division between the north and the south in Israel. Elijah had the opportunity to demonstrate to the people that the prophets of Baal were helpless, that they really could not control the gods, and they could not control the weather. The very basic thing that they have to be able to do in order to be prophets of Baal is control the weather. That was the whole basis of the religion. So Elijah is making that point. In let's start at verse 17. Ahab saw Elijah coming, and Ahab said, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" And Elijah answered, "I've not troubled Israel, but you have, your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals." So that's the issue. And it's a fundamental political issue. When our political leaders choose to renounce the worship of God and follow other philosophical principles, which is what religion really is, they have made themselves enemies of God, and their work will produce destruction for their people. This is true everywhere and in every culture, but it's demonstrated here in Israel. So Elijah says to Ahab, "Send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and summon the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Now, I haven't introduced Jezebel. Jezebel was a Phoenician witch who married Ahab, became her queen. The Ahab-Jezebel unit, this couple, symbolized the alliance between the Phoenicians, who are a pagan people, and Israel, which became increasingly pagan during Ahab's reign. Ahab is a very bad man. So Ahab sent to all of the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. I believe that Ahab simply assumed that his Baal prophets would have no difficulty doing whatever Elijah needed. There's only one of Elijah, and there's 850 prophets, so there'll be no trouble. The bad Elijah guy will simply be killed, and that'll be the end of that. So Elijah came near to all the people and said to them, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions?" That's the English Standard Version, and it's actually a very good translation. The Hebrew word is limping. It's trying to make your way slowly and painfully between two alternate positions. Will you worship God or will you worship Baal? And the limping there is something that the Baal prophets actually did when they were trying to convince Baal that it was time to wake up and time to wake up and begin making rain again. And I'm going to let's see here. I'm going to try to get. I can't get it. Yeah, nope, can't get that to come. Security, stop video. Oh, how interesting. Okay, I was trying to see if I could see the other participants so I could hear, get any chat. I'm getting an audio weird thing, getting a cutting in and out. Okay, sorry about that. A little technical thing going on my end. How long will you go limping between two opinions? One of your opinions is wrong. Both Baal and God cannot both be the bringers of rain. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. And the people did not answer a word because they didn't know what to think. There's a whole lot of social pressure going on here. All of the thought leaders of the people of Israel believed that Baal was God and Asherah was the goddess, and there were lots of Baals and Asherahs, and that they could be relied upon to bring the rain. And Elijah challenges that presupposition, that opinion that is false. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. And the people didn't answer. So Elijah said, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves and cut it in pieces, lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood and put no fire to it. So we're going to build 2 altars. We're going to put wood on both piles. We're going to put a bull cut up into pieces on top of the wood. And the Baal prophets will have their opportunity. They can do their best. They can do all of the things that they claim will bring the rain. All they have to do is call down fire and thunder from heaven. When Baal is shown in statues, we see him carrying a thunderbolt in one hand and something else like a club in the other hand. And these 2 are the assistant gods, Kothar and Hasis. Kothar is thunder and Hasis is lightning. Thunder and lightning. So Baal is primarily known as the bringer of thunder and lightning. And it has been at this point many years since either thunder or lightning has come. And presumably all during this time, the prophets of Baal have been doing their best. Now it comes down to a public test. Let us see which opinion is correct. Elijah says, I believe that the God of heaven is the only God who can bring rain. You teach that Baal can do this. Let's give it a try. You call upon the name of your God, verse 24. I will call upon the name of my God. And the God who answers by fire is God. It's a very simple test. You claim that your God can send the fire. I claim that my God can send the fire. It's time to put up or shut up. Let's see which of us has the correct opinion, and let's all of these people see which of these opinions is true. Very simple test. So all of the people answered, "That is well spoken." And Elijah said to the prophets, "Choose yourself a bull." And they took a bull, and the one that was given to them, they prepared it. They called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." And there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. So there is the standard Baal worship is going on. They called and they limped, but there was no voice and there was no answer. Nothing. The skies are blue. There is no cloud in the sky, and there is certainly no rain. At noon, Elijah mocked them. Now, this would seem a little unfair, but sometimes it is necessary to point out the stupidity of the non-godly position. Sometimes in politics, that is necessary as well. Those who do not believe in the God of reality are doomed to live with the consequences of their stupidity. They are simply wrong, and their wrongness needs to be made clear. So Elijah began to mock them. He said, "Cry aloud, for surely he is a God." Maybe he is musing. He's thinking about something, or he is relieving himself. That's nice. English Standard Version is one of the first modern versions to translate this correctly. Perhaps he's in the little room behind the big room, or perhaps he is on a journey, which is something that the Baal theology teaches. Perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. And of course, that's what the Baal prophets taught. Baal is asleep. He's not really dead, he's asleep. And all we're going to do is wake him up. And so the Baal priests, recognizing that they were in serious trouble, cried aloud. They began to cut themselves, as was their custom, with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. The shedding of blood is an important part of the ritual. To this day, it's an important part of satanic ritual. The shedding of blood, the drinking of blood, the pouring of blood on altars is an important element of all of this. And they cried aloud, they cut themselves. As midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. Raving is an unusual word. We don't often find it in the Old Testament. It means to speak words that have no obvious meaning, what we would call blubbering or babbling. This is an example in the Old Testament of what Paul in the New Testament calls the non-gift speaking in tongues. When the Corinthians were speaking to God in tongues, they were actually just babbling. They were not making real language. This is a satanic gift and is is not of value to believers. The Baal prophets began to rave and cut themselves, and it didn't work. There was no voice, there was no answer, no one paid attention. It's as though God simply had left his phone off the hook, and he couldn't be gotten. So Elijah said to all the people, as the prophets of Baal are beginning to run out of steam, Elijah raised his voice and said in verse 30, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar. He made a trench about it, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed, which is a lot. And he put the wood in order and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water, pour it on the burnt offerings." And he said, "Do it a second time, and do it a third time." And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. Now, the point of the water is to demonstrate that uh, this offering and the wood are wet. He's not going to be able to start this fire easily, not even with a torch. It's necessary for the people to see that a miracle is being done. Uh, the essence of what I call a Class A biblical miracle is that it is an apparent violation of physical law. You can't start wet wood, for example. That authenticates the messenger. And so Elijah himself publicly is claiming that he is calling down a miracle. The miracle doesn't just happen out of the blue, as it were, but Elijah is personally calling down the miracle. And I have to say, at great risk to himself. If the miracle doesn't happen, Elijah is out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the prophets of Baal and Asherah and all of these hostile people. So he's making himself very, very vulnerable. So Elijah says, there it is. And at the time of the offering, Elijah came near and says very publicly, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. I am your servant, and I've done all these things at your word." This is an authentication of Elijah and the words of Elijah. So the messenger and the message. Always with biblical prophecy, there is this initiating round of miracle. After Elijah and Elisha, we're not going to see these remarkable miracles again until the time of Christ and the apostles. Miracle is fairly rare in the biblical narrative. Uh, some people believe that there ought to be miracles all the time. And the fact is, that isn't true. Elijah calls down a miracle, and the fire of the Lord fell, verse 38, and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water. So this is the ultimate zot foof that we see in the sacrificial offerings of the Old Testament. I suspect this has not happened regularly. throughout Israel's history. The fire of God fell from heaven. This is the lightning bolt of lightning. And the foof is the rise of smoke and steam and dust and debris up into the air as a recognition that God is accepting this offering. It was utterly obvious to everyone present that a miracle had taken place. The fire fell. Verse 39, when the people saw it, they began to fall on their face and shout together, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, let not one escape. They seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon at the base of the Carmel and slaughtered them there. The Hebrew word is emphatic. The slaughter was an ugly thing. These men and women who were the prophets of Baal and Asherah were put to death in a grotesque way. I'm not particularly fond of violence, but in this case, that's what was necessary. This is a major milestone, a demonstration for anyone who was watching that there is one God in heaven above, and he is the God of the Bible, the God of reality. So this is a dramatic moment. And Elijah at this point said to Ahab, it would be wise for you to get up, eat and drink, for I hear the sound of the rushing of rain. Now, of course, there was no rain at this point. So Ahab went up to eat and drink. Ahab went up to eat and drink. It's a very strange thing to say, surrounded by all these angry people and a bunch of dead prophets. I am a little surprised that Ahab wasn't grabbed at the same time and put to death. Nevertheless, Ahab ate and drank, and Elijah, meanwhile, went back up to the top of Mount Carmel. He bowed himself down to the earth, put his face between his knees, said to his servant, go look toward the sea, toward the west. And the servant said, there's nothing there. Look again, and there was nothing there. And finally, the seventh time, he said, I see a tiny little cloud like a man's hand rising from the sea. And Elijah said, go up, say to Elijah, get into your chariot and go on down, lest the rain stop you. And in a little while, the heavens grew black with clouds and wind. There was a great rain, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And at that point, the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. This is a fascinating story. This is what we might call a mountaintop experience for Elijah. This is, for Elijah, this is the absolute high point of his ministry. It's obviously a confrontative ministry. It's a ministry of pointing out sin. But on this occasion, Elijah, in front of all the people of Israel, in the presence of all these prophets, with the king watching on, did a remarkable miracle and demonstrated the reality of his message. So this is a very, very big deal. And this demonstrates that the idols of the pagans are worthless and only the God of reality should be worshiped. Very valuable thing. And a very big deal for Elijah. So it's interesting that after that very, very high event, Elijah should experience a low. And I'm going to stop the share for a moment here, because as we get into chapter 19, we see the low that follows a high. And this is something that, frankly, everyone in pastoral ministry probably can relate to. So I'll tell this story quickly. Ahab got back to Jezreel. I'll show you a picture of Jezreel in a minute. There isn't much to see there, but we know where it is. Ahab and Jezebel lived in this place overlooking the Jezreel Valley. That's a real nice location, but there isn't much left of the archaeological site. So Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and Jezebel said, "Boy, am I going to get you! You have absolutely had it, Elijah. I'm going to get you this time, and you're a dead man." And Elijah was afraid. Now, this is fascinating because the day before, Elijah had confronted all of these people, violent, angry people, on top of Mount Carmel. And God had protected him. God had not only protected him, but had given them victory over all of his enemies, had demonstrated his own power in the presence of all of this evil. And Elijah now decides that he's afraid. So Jezebel said, "I'm going to get you." Elijah was afraid. He ran for his life, came all the way to Beersheba, which is some 70 miles, 100 kilometers south of Jezreel. That, under anybody's circumstances, that's a long way to run. He'd run all the way into the Negev desert. And he himself went a day's journey beyond his servant. His servant ran out of steam at Beersheba. He went another day's journey into the wilderness, sat down under a broom tree. He said, "It's time to die." Elijah is so discouraged. He is so exhausted. He is so spiritually down that he's ready to die. He says, "It's enough now, Lord, take away my life. I'm no better than my fathers." He lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise, eat." And behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water, and he ate and drank and lay down some more. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him, said, "Arise, eat, the journey is too great for you." And he ate and drank, and the strength of that went into him. And for 40 days and 40 nights, he marched on to Sinai, Mount Horeb. And at that point, the Lord began to speak to him again. Now, all of this is interesting stuff. On Mount Horeb, Elijah complains to God, "I alone am left. Out of all of your people, I alone am left." And God says to Elijah, "Don't be silly, Elijah. There are still at least 800 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. You're not alone. You just think you are. You're feeling down, but everything will be good."
7,000.
7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. I'm glad I've got a fact checker here in the next chair. Donna has the freedom to look quickly through her Bible to find my mistakes, as she found one.
Rarely. I rarely find it.
A
Rarely.
lot of times I'll forget something. I'm having a Joe Biden moment here. Hi, I'm Dr. McMath, and I've forgotten this message. 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. And then God goes on to give Elijah a specific mission, another job to do. go and anoint a king of Syria. And also, the most important thing that God gave Elijah on Mount Sinai was the task of making a disciple. Now, let's back this up and look at the practical point of Elijah's exhaustion. Why was he exhausted? Well, he was exhausted because he had done the ministry well. When he went to Mount Carmel, he reached a high point in his ministry. On that day and in those hours, he used up all of his spiritual reservoir of energy. And afterwards, he was quite literally exhausted. When I first studied this passage maybe 50 years ago, I honestly didn't understand what this was talking about. I really had questions about what was going on with Elijah. I thought maybe he was turning into a wimp in his old age or something. I didn't know what was wrong with Elijah until I first became a pastor. In the pastorate, we're expected to get up on a Sunday morning and deliver a sermon. And I discovered that every week a pastor goes through a cycle, and during the work week, by about Tuesday, the passage, if not selected ahead of time, has been selected, and some of the spade work of understanding the passage has been done. Maybe some commentaries read, and some initial notes are taken. By Wednesday, I'm doing some other things, maybe visiting in the hospital, maybe meeting with some people, and thinking about what I'm going to be preaching. By Thursday, I'm doing some serious praying and meditating through the passage. I'm beginning to look for the big idea. I'm beginning to look for major points I can illustrate. I'm beginning to look for an outline that will work me through the passage. I'm beginning to see how God intends to move in the lives of my people. By Thursday evening, I'm beginning to get seriously excited about what's going to happen on Sunday. Friday, I'm doing other kinds of things. I'm having meetings with people, and the whole time, Sunday's message is beginning to percolate deep inside of me. Saturday, I'm like a horse at the starting gate. I can hardly wait for Saturday to be over with, because I've got this great message that I've been preparing and I'm ready to go. Sunday morning, it's church time, and we have to begin with prayer, and we begin with announcements, and we begin with singing, and I'm sitting there in my seat waiting for it to be over so I can bring the message that God has given me. And finally, I stand up in front of God's people and deliver the message that God has given me. I use at that point all of the energy that's been pent up in me. God Himself energizes that message to transform the people of God and to energize them to do the works that God has called them to do. It is a genuine high point of the week. Afterwards, I find that I sit down and I'm tired. I'm genuinely exhausted. If you're not a pastor, talk to your pastor about this. He will tell you that when the preaching has gone right, when he's done it well, he is utterly exhausted at the end of the sermon time. I pray specifically for men that I know who have to preach 2 or 3 or more times on a Sunday, as we do in the Philippines so regularly. That's very hard work. It's very difficult to do. I remember early in my pastorate, I would preach on a Sunday morning. I would stand at the door and say goodbye to all of the people. And then Donna and I would go back to our house. She would have dinner for me. And then we would often take a nap. I'm not sure she needed the nap as badly as I did, but we would take a nap. We would eat, we would sleep, and I would do nothing else strenuous the rest of the day. On Monday, I tried to take the day off. There is a kind of a post-Sunday discouragement that hits every pastor. Our teachers always used to tell us, never resign on a Monday. Because on Monday, you're always going to be hating what you had just done on Sunday. You remember each of your errors and each of your shortcomings, and nothing that you did feels right. And all of your work seems to be in vain, and everybody hates you and nobody likes you, and you may as well go eat worms. Monday is a good day to go play golf, so that at least you can feel bad about something else. I never did learn to play golf, but I learned to get away from it all on Monday. And then on Tuesday, I'm back into the grind, and I begin doing the grunt labor of the next week. And then Wednesday at its meetings and visitings, and Thursday I'm starting to get excited again, and the cycle continues. And I got used to that cycle, and I learned to budget my energy so that I was always ready for a Sunday. That mountaintop will almost inevitably be followed by a physiological low. That's what Elijah was going through. God solved that for him by providing food and drink and rest, and then by encouraging him with his words. The word of God is always an encouragement. And he followed that with a job to do and a disciple to work with. And so we're introduced to Elijah. And I'm going to get the share going again. We'll go back to this slide and on to the next one. The end of chapter 9, we see the call of Elisha. Now, the names Elijah and Elisha are pretty similar. And it turns out Elisha wanted to follow Elijah. And Elijah said, oh, you don't really want to follow me. I don't have anything to give you. I've got no food. I've got no place to sleep. And Elisha said, no, I'm going to follow you. And Elijah tried to talk him out of it. Elisha decided he would go. And we see this as the beginning of a long episode in Elijah's life where he has a disciple now. And Elisha is going to end up with a double portion of Elijah's spirit. We don't really know what that means. Some have suggested that this is the double ability to do miracles, because there appear to be, depending on how you count them, there appear to be twice as many miracles attributed to Elisha as were attributed to Elijah. That's a hard one to know for sure. In chapters 20 through 22, we see a sequence of episodes with Ahab. Ahab is a really bad king. He has a series of wars with Ben-Hadad of Syria, and ends up actually beating the Syrians, but fails to destroy Ben-Hadad, who is going to come back for a second round and be defeated again. Uh, it's an interesting sequence, and for those of us who are keeping track of the interaction of Israel and Judah with all of the surrounding nations is kind of important, but for our purposes, doesn't matter very much. Chapter 21 is uh, significant for the evil of Jezebel and Ahab. Ahab saw a vineyard that he wanted. And that vineyard is probably visible from this spot. The slide that you see here is the mound that we call Jezreel. And I call this place the essence of Ahab and Jezebel. For Ahab and Jezebel were the only people who ever lived here. So all of the pottery and the other artifacts that we find here date to the time of the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. It's a relatively small town in a really nice place. It's about a day's journey north of Samaria and was apparently their summer house. At any rate, from this spot, you could look in a variety of directions, and there are vineyards today. One of those vineyards belonged to a man named Naboth. And Ahab liked that vineyard, and he talked to Naboth and tried to buy it. And Naboth said, "How can I sell this? This is my land. It's been in my family ever since the conquest 500 years ago. How could I possibly sell my land?" And Ahab was all upset. He went back to Jezebel and says, "Naboth is being mean to me. He wouldn't sell me his vineyard." And Jezebel says, are you the king or what? I'll show you what to do. And so Jezebel went out and hired a couple of bad guys to tell lies about Naboth. And so these bad men bore false witness. They lied to the priests about Naboth. And Naboth was taken out and put to death. Because he was dead, Ahab could just grab his land, which was a really, really rotten thing to do. It's a bad thing. In the end of chapter 21, Elijah condemns Ahab, actually condemns him to death for the murder of Naboth and the stealing of the land. Ahab sort of repented, but not really. In chapter 22, we see an interesting interaction between Jehoshaphat and Ahab. This is going to be a war against Syria. The war against Syria is going to go on for a while and is interesting in a lot of ways. Here we see Ahab and Jehoshaphat getting together for battle. And before they go, Ahab says, "Oh, wouldn't it be a good idea for us to do some divination and see if the gods are with us?" Well, Jehoshaphat says, "That I suppose that's a good idea, but don't you have anybody besides these prophets of Baal?" I don't know where Ahab recruited new prophets of Baal, but apparently he's got a new batch. And the prophets of Baal are running around doing their rituals and telling Ahab that he's going to be victorious. Jehoshaphat says, "Don't you have any prophet of the Lord around here?" And Ahab says, "Well, there is one, a character by the name of Micaiah. But he never has anything nice to say about me. So I don't listen to him anymore." Jehoshaphat insisted. And so Micaiah the prophet is brought before the kings of Israel. And you can visualize the court of Ahab at Samaria, the ivory palaces of Ahab, with hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah running around, cutting themselves, speaking in tongues, and doing their various stupid rituals, and pretending that Ahab is going to destroy the king of Syria. Micaiah stands up and says, "Oh, King Ahab, I assume you'd like me to say something nice. So just to make you happy, I'll predict that you'll be just fine. You'll beat the king of Syria." And Ahab says, "Didn't I ask you to come and tell me the truth? You see what I'm telling you, Jehoshaphat? This guy never has anything good to say. He's always lying to me." So Micaiah gives a prophecy from God. He says, "You're going to go before the king of Syria and you will be killed in that battle." And Ahab says, "I told you he never has anything good to say about me." And so Micaiah is taken out. Well, the next day, Ahab went into battle, and by a sheer coincidence, one of the archers of Syria shot an arrow up into the air, even though Ahab was dressed up like a nobody and the robes of Ahab were on Jehoshaphat. And Ahab got killed in that battle. And so Jehoshaphat went home and the Syrians won that battle. It's not a very good way to end the book of First Kings, but that's the end of that. The end of this book, we see Jehoshaphat and reigning over the south, and the reigns of Ahaziah over Israel. Ahaziah is not very important, so we're going to ignore him, and I think we will get into the ministry of Elijah and Elisha in these first few chapters of Second Kings. You'll remember that First and Second Kings are all a part of one longer scroll in Hebrew, and the scrolls were divided up by the Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. So this just continues. In chapter 1 of Second Kings, we see the continuation after the death of Ahab of both the northern and southern kingdoms. And eventually Jehoshaphat, we see Jehoshaphat dead in Judah at the end of Second Kings, and that leaves a not so good king in the south and nobody very important in the north. The ministry of Elisha is going to continue. In chapter 1, we see King Ahaziah in the north. And Elijah is going to denounce Ahaziah. This happens during the during the revolt of another local vassal state, namely Moab. The Moabites were always enemies of Israel. David subjected the Moabites. But here we have a revolt of Moab. And Ahaziah fell through the lattice, and he asked Elisha or Elijah, "Am I going to be okay?" Elijah said, "No, you're going to die." Messengers came to the king and said, "You're going to die." So the king was not happy. He wanted a better answer. And he began sending messengers to Elijah. And Elijah zapped them. He zapped two of the three sets of messengers. The third messenger treated Elijah with proper respect and didn't get zapped. And the message goes back to Ahaziah, "You're going to die." And eventually, Ahaziah died, which is the way it worked. As for the rest of the acts of Ahaziah, since he had no son, are they not written of in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? And he died. Chapter 2 is Elijah's translation. A translation is a bodily taking up of the prophet into heaven. We see this in several places in the Bible. The other possible translation may be Moses. Not everybody agrees that Moses was taken up. earlier than Moses, we have a character in the pre-flood characters who seems to have been taken up into heaven. That's interesting. But Elijah is actually visibly taken up in a chariot with a bit of a tornado, and Elisha is given the opportunity to watch the translation of Elijah. And he sees the whirlwind. He sees the chariots and the fiery horses, and down they come. And Elijah jumps into the chariot, and off they go and disappear in a cloud of smoke. And Elisha calls out, "Oh, the chariots and the horses of Israel, my father, my father." But before his translation, Elijah had said, "If you see me when I go up, you will receive a double portion of my spirit." And Elijah's mantle, his long coat that he wore, fell away from the chariot. And Elisha picked it up and began to wear Elijah's mantle. This is the transfer of the ministry from Elijah to Elisha. And following this, Elisha begins to do a very similar ministry to that was done by Elijah. And we see his ministry in chapters 3 through 8 of 2 Kings. He continues to counsel the kings of Israel. We come through a sequence of kings of Israel, and none of them are very good, and it doesn't really matter very much what happens here. One of the interesting details of this little section, we've got war with the kings of Moab, and there's a king of Moab named Misha at this time. And Misha was fighting against the kings of Judah, actually, and the armies of Judah were fighting against the armies of Moab, and they surrounded the capital city of Misha. The king of Moab saw that the battle was going against him. This is chapter 3 and verse 26. He took with him 700 swordsmen to break through the king of Edom, but he couldn't get through. And then he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. And then came for him great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew and returned to their own land. We're told that this was so disgusting to the people of Israel that they simply went home. They couldn't take it anymore. Now, that's a strange episode, and rather an unusual episode. Significantly, there is a tall tablet, a stone monument called the Misha Stele, which is in the museum called the Louvre in Paris. And on the Misha Stele, we have the story of King Misha sacrificing his son on the walls of his capital in order to bring the blessings of Baal, or Molech, I believe is the god that he was worshiping, against the oppressor Israel, and how Molech delivered Misha from the oppressor. It's a fascinating confirmation of the biblical text, and also serves as a correlation between the two lines of history. So that's what's going on there. Chapter 4 Elisha, and the widow's oil. Here we have a widow who doing without and has no food, and she's taking care of Elisha, and Elisha notices that she has no oil. He'd like some oil, and she has none. So she says, "Well, go and go to all of your neighbors and ask them for as much as you can carry. Take as many jars as you can borrow, and go ask for oil." And she borrows as many as she can get, and they're all full. And when those are all done, that's all of the oil there's going to be. And Elisha says, you really should have asked for more jars. You should have had greater faith. At any rate, one day Elijah went to a place called Shunem, and here we see the resurrection of the Shunammite's son. This is the rest of chapter 4. Elisha is doing miracles. The oil was one of the things that Baal provided. Resurrection is something that Baal would do. In the end of chapter 4, we see the death in the pot. O man of God, there is death in the pot. These are the sons of the prophets, who are probably what I would call Bible college students. They can't afford enough to eat, and they're studying the Bible, getting ready to be prophets in their own right. And they have a communal pot of stew. We used to do this in seminary. And there would be whatever was available would go into the pot every day. And we would keep that boiling on the stove in the commons. And anybody who was hungry would come and have lunch there. And there was a sign in the kitchen that said, "O man of God, there is death in the pot." And it was never very good stew, but it was always there. Elisha purified the stew by putting an herb into it, and the Lord delivered his people. Naaman is going to be healed of prophecy. That's in chapter 5. Naaman the Syrian. And he didn't want to be baptized in just any old water. He wanted something impressive. And God's or Elisha said, if I told you to do some great thing, would you have been impressed? And he says, well, yes. Okay, just go be baptized someplace. And when he was washed, the healing took place. Chapter 6, we see the recovery of an axe head. Again, the sons of the prophets with a borrowed axe head. This is how I know they're Bible college students. They can't even afford their own axe head. And when the axe head falls off in the water, Elisha raises it. This is a faith-building episode. The rest of chapter 6, we see more war with the Syrians. This is followed by the Syrian siege of Jerusalem, or not Jerusalem, but of Samaria. The end of chapter 6 and on into chapter 7. As this siege of Samaria goes on, we see a fascinating picture of the lepers of Samaria. The lepers of Samaria, there's a group of lepers who have to live outside of the city. They have to wear their face masks and shout, "Unclean, unclean," whenever everybody comes around. So they couldn't live in the city, as the social distancing was important to them. So they were there, and they would be the first to die when the Syrians finally attacked. And one day they were starving, had no food. They said to themselves, why don't we go over to the Syrian camp and throw ourselves on the tender mercy of the Syrians? And when they went, they discovered that the angel of the Lord had gone through that camp and chased away the Syrian armies, and that the people of Samaria had been delivered. So the lepers went through the camp and they began gathering up food and storing it back in their tents and going and getting some more. Like the little mouse in Cinderella, the old Disney movie. Maybe that hasn't gotten to Italy. I don't know.
Mhm.
But Gus the mouse with all of his kernels of corn, and he's carrying them back to his spot and being attacked by Lucifer the cat. I love that image. And here's this leper. And finally, one of the lepers says to one of the others, shouldn't we maybe tell the people in town that there's so much food in the Syrian camp? Ultimately, the sharing of the gospel when we do evangelism is one starving beggar telling another starving beggar where to find the bread. That's all we're doing. We've got no great power, but we were starving before we found the bread. Why can't we tell them? That's chapter 7. That's the main thing. The Syrians are gone. Chapter 8. Elijah is going to predict that Hazael will reign. And then finally, we've got a couple more reigns of a pair of Jorams and some other bad guys. Jehu is going to reign, and we'll look at King Jehu, jumping Jehu, in chapter 9 of 2 Kings, when we return on Wednesday. And so we're going to get all the way to 2 Kings 8, and we'll begin in 2 Kings 9 on Wednesday. I'm going to make this stop the share, and now I can see everybody, and we turn on the gallery. We'll unmute everybody so we can say hi. That was fun. We got through a lot of territory. It's good to see everybody again. We finally got up to a total of 17 of us. I know that Oscar and Sally will be on their way back to the Philippines on